Good evening, everyone. My name is Sheila Presley, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, which I hope you are aware, the Fine Arts Museums are both the de Young in Golden Gate Park and the Legion of Honor in Lincoln Park. I am very excited to welcome you to our opening Friday night of our 10th season of Friday Nights at the de Young. For the next 35 straight Friday nights, we will be here providing great art, great music, great lectures, great hands-on art making, and all sorts of other crazy things. So we hope you will come back and join us again for Friday Nights at the de Young. One of the most important goals of Friday Nights at the de Young is to share with our audiences, to bring to our audiences really important and influential speakers and provide a comfortable, casual environment. And so it's so appropriate that tonight we have Dr. Cody Hartley has come from Santa Fe to address us tonight. It's perfect for our opening night. Dr. Hartley is the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. Dr. Hartley was previously, before the O'Keeffe Museum, he worked at the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And although he spent many years doing very impressive work on the East Coast, it seems as though his heart was always in the Southwest. And his academic and his professional backgrounds really mirror this love and interest of the Southwest. Dr. Hartley wrote his PhD dissertation on the emergence of museums in Santa Fe. It was entitled Art in an Arid Climate, the Museums of New Mexico and the Cultivation of the Arts in Santa Fe. How happy he must have been to arrive at the O'Keeffe Museum in 2013, just in time to work on the exhibition, Modern Nature, Georgia O'Keeffe and Lake George. And how happy and lucky are we that Dr. Hartley is here with us tonight to talk about that very same exhibition. Please help me in welcoming Cody Hartley to the podium tonight.
Let me start by thanking all of you for joining us this evening and coming in from the party in the lobby. I feel honored that you're willing to give up the dancing and the drinks to hear me talk about Georgia. I also want to extend my gratitude, of course, to the de Young Museum for inviting me to speak and, moreover, for hosting Modern Nature, this outstanding exhibition, and bringing it to a wider audience and helping us kind of spread O'Keeffe's legacy. I need to thank in absentia Erin Coe. She's the chief curator of the Hyde Collection and the mastermind behind this exhibition. Some of you, I hope, had a chance to hear her when she was speaking for the opening of this exhibition. I'm delighted to be here myself tonight to share some of the lessons we've learned about Georgia O'Keeffe from this exhibition. Erin and I, the chief curator, became acquainted just a little less than a year ago. I started my position as Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum at the very end of April, and immediately we began discussing the opening of Modern Nature at the Hyde Collection, where this exhibition began its life last June. If you visited Glens Falls, New York, you know that the Hyde Collection is a small gem of a museum built around an historic home and the outstanding collection of Charlotte Prune Hyde and her husband, Louis Fisk Hyde. Surprisingly, the Hyde Collection doesn't own a single artwork by Georgia O'Keeffe. Despite being located just miles from the southwest shore of Lake George, where the Stieglitz family summered and where Georgia O'Keeffe spent such important moments. Thus, it seems all the more remarkable, the fact that they don't own a single O'Keeffe, that they were able to be the guiding energy behind the creation of this exhibition. Organizing a national traveling exhibition is a sophisticated logistical puzzle. Loan negotiations often require the finesse of a seasoned diplomat, and every single borrowed work adds costs and complications. Hence, most museums work from the strengths of their existing collections, supplementing with only the most essential loans. This, of course, was not an option for the Hyde collection. Nonetheless, after being barraged with questions about O'Keeffe, Stieglitz, and their life at Lake George from her very first day on the job, Erin believed this was an important topic for the Hyde collection to tackle. Excuse me. Moreover, she recognized that her familiarity with the region made her uniquely qualified to bring fresh insight to the study of O'Keeffe's work and life. One of the central tenets of this exhibition is the importance of Lake George as a formative environment and a place of dramatic, artistic, and creative growth for Miss O'Keeffe has been greatly underappreciated. And indeed, Modern Nature, the exhibition, reveals that the Lake George years were among the most fruitful and dynamic of her career, and that her experiences at Lake George specifically were essential to the emergence of O'Keeffe as a singularly iconic American modernist painter. Even as some scholars claim that her most important contributions to American art all occurred before 1929, as if visiting New Mexico was somehow the beginning of the end in terms of her originality and relevance to an East Coast-centric art history, too few have seriously looked at the works produced at and about Lake George in that decade, the 1920s primarily. The origins of this dismissal can be traced to O'Keeffe herself. Later in life, after relocating to New Mexico, and after the death of Alfred Stieglitz, she was increasingly dismissive of the time at Lake George, emphasizing instead her annoyance at the gregarious Stieglitz family, the claustrophobic, overgrown landscape of the Adirondacks, and the green that she had to endure while she was there. She consciously fashioned herself as the artist of the desert, strong and alone, austere and tough, like her chosen landscape. One of the first lessons any art historian learns is to question the words of artists. They are, generally, not an entirely reliable source when it comes to understanding their own life and work. My apologies to the artists in the audience. Nonetheless, it seems that many art historians have taken George O'Keeffe at her word and believed that Lake George was unpleasant and unimportant for her. The great gift that Erin Coe, through Modern Nature, has offered us is a chance to return to the moment and reconsider the significance of O'Keeffe's time at that property overlooking Tea Island Bay, known simply as The Hill. This evening, I want to share with you some of the lessons and discoveries made as a result of gathering these works together for study. As the new head of the curatorial program at the O'Keeffe Museum, and the museum's second curator since its opening in 1997, the exhibition has provided an unparalleled opportunity for me to deepen my knowledge of her practice and technique. I'm trained as an American art historian with an emphasis on art of the late 19th through mid-20th centuries. I've never considered myself an O'Keeffe specialist previously. In fact, that dissertation that was mentioned, I pretty much wrapped it up right before O'Keeffe got to New Mexico, so I wouldn't have to wrestle with her. I certainly never expected to dedicate so much of my time and energy to a single artist, though I can say the experience has more than rewarded this investment. Some of the observations I share are personal discoveries, shaped by the experience of getting to know O'Keeffe through Lake George. Others reflect realizations and revelations observed by my colleagues at the O'Keeffe Museum throughout the development of the show. The validity of Erin's thesis was confirmed repeatedly as the folks who have spent nearly 2 decades showing O'Keeffe's artwork, conditioning, conserving, and transporting more O'Keeffes than any living soul on earth, continued to see new things and found examples of techniques and practice that diverged from her later patterns. Tonight, I'll organize these lessons into 3 broad categories. First, what we've learned about her artistic practice. Second, what we've learned about her life and relationship with Stieglitz. And third, how the Lake George years provided a template for the lifestyle she would later establish in New Mexico. So starting with the artistic practice. What is different about O'Keeffe's Lake George work as opposed to work from other periods in her life? One of the first things we noticed was a degree of fluidity and visible experimentation that was surprising. The Georgia O'Keeffe that we've come to know from the 30s, 40s, and beyond is an incredibly confident and deliberate painter. One of the great discoveries of living and working closely with her artwork is her supreme technical ability, which is complemented by an almost supernatural power of vision. Prior to the arrival of modern nature in my galleries in Santa Fe last fall, we had an exhibition focusing on O'Keeffe's first decade of work in New Mexico. From these works, and from studying our collection of finished paintings, accompanied by related sketches, I saw constant affirmation of the reports that O'Keeffe pre-visualized her paintings. That is to say, she imagined the completed work entirely in her mind before starting work on the canvas. And from the time her hand drew the first charcoal outline of the underdrawing until the last brushstroke, she almost never wavered and never revised her composition or design. Her sketches and underdrawings are remarkable in themselves, as they record only essential lines. Perhaps I'm a simpleton, but I think for many, artists or otherwise, if asked to draw a tree, the human mind tends to focus on the structure and will outline the complete form of the tree based upon our knowledge of the physical, three-dimensional configuration of trees. Even if some of those branches and limbs might be obscured by leaves or smaller limbs from a particular vantage point, we draw the whole thing. O'Keeffe, on the other hand, draws only those lines that are visible and will appear in the final composition. Her eye seems to effortlessly translate from three-dimensional visual perception to a two-dimensional flat rendering with perfect efficiency. We're currently in our gallery showing nearly a dozen of her paintings of the cottonwood trees that grow along the Chama River Valley, which is visible from her studio and bedroom at Abiquiu. It's a subject that she painted serially in the 50s through varying seasons and light conditions, and looking at the related sketches and underdrawings for unfinished paintings demonstrates her extreme economy of line. In fact, her visual memory was so astute, it could be many months between when she began a composition and when it was finished. We know this in part because of her framing techniques. O'Keeffe was incredibly consistent in how she framed her works, primarily utilizing one of two styles and working almost exclusively with just a few frame makers. There's the silver-gilded wooden clamshell frame made by George Off and a thin-rolled brass metal frame. You can see examples of both in the show. Often we see the metal frames with a variety of finishes, in some cases even two-tone, with the transition in color aligning with her composition, with the horizon line, for example. Contrary to what one might expect, to achieve this effect and ensure that the metal treatment, that line on the frame, aligned with her design, the horizon, after preparing the canvas and starting the underdrawing, she actually sent the canvas off to New York to have the frame made. It could be many months before she would receive the completed frame and the unfinished canvas back. So she might start the cottonwood in spring, but wouldn't actually paint it, that is, fully bring color to the painting, until the next fall. Yet over the course of those months, she retained the memory of the budding yellow-green of new growth perfectly. Furthermore, in her mature works, we almost never see evidence of her wiping down a section of the canvas to repaint, a not unusual technique for many artists seeking to correct and adjust an aspect of their composition. She doesn't change her mind, and she doesn't make mistakes. And if she did, she destroyed the canvas rather than leaving any visual evidence of the revision to distract from the final achievement. At Lake George, however, we see several examples of her making quite dramatic changes. In Lake George with White Birch from 1921, it's plainly obvious that she shifted the position and height of the trees, leaving a noticeable pentimento, or alteration. So that's what you see here, and then in detail here. In other works, the degree of revision and change is even more dramatic. In the painting of Alfred Stieglitz's Dark Room, what was known as the Little House or the White House, there is evidence that she made such a dramatic change. This is a subject she painted several times, revealing quite different approaches, and it's related to images Stieglitz took of his dark room. Of the images made by O'Keeffe, the two in modern nature are particularly interesting. If we look closely at the 1925 flagpole, we notice that she has certainly changed the shape of the moon, or was it actually a sun before? We can see the little circle of the moon within, the little circle of white, within the half moon. As we look at the halo around the moon, there is some indication that it was painted after the rest of the sky, as in on top of the previous sky. Looking closely at some of the edges, along the flagpole and around the halo, there is evidence that suggests that O'Keeffe actually made a radical revision, changing this from a daytime scene to a nocturne. Such dramatic repainting is unheard of later in her career. I'll say more about the other flagpole in a moment, but let me say more about the fluidity and experimentation visible in the Lake George works first. There are a number of works where we see O'Keeffe exploring new subjects, but also new techniques and compositional strategies. Consider the many fine still lifes in the show. There are wonderful paintings of apples, picked from the orchards at Lake George, which O'Keeffe herself enjoyed maintaining, with careful pruning and fertilization while she worked alongside Donald Davidson, the husband of Stieglitz's sister Elizabeth. These are Cezanne-esque in some cases, with the surface turned up towards the viewer and great passages of color blocked against color. They convey her excitement over the harvest. Stieglitz called it apple fever. She also produced more unusual studies of produce, including the alligator pears or avocados, which you'll see in the galleries. Those did not grow at Lake George, of course, but she did purchase them at the store and draw them, paint them. If you will, study the surface of the work included in the exhibition. She is applying paint in unusual ways, particularly with white. Some cases using a palette knife, treating it almost like frosting. More often, she is incredibly economical in her application of paint, using the very thinnest layer of oil to cover the ground. But in Lake George, she's more experimental. It is part of a series of images done at this time, this work, all quite odd and atypical. Clearly, she is working through some specific challenges relating to composition, balance, and determining how far to carry abstraction from visual reality. Ultimately, these are actually not her most successful paintings, and yet she retained the two variations of this, pink pendants, until the end of her life, indicating that they represented a meaningful development that she was wanting to track and retain. So here you see a whole range of these where she's moved from charcoal sketch to a more representational, if slightly loose rendition, to these two pendant pieces. Only one of them appears in the show, but you see very clearly that she's playing with every aspect of the composition and trying out different ways of working. Decisions about composition, about how mass should be arranged on a canvas, how to divide space and create a dynamic, interesting whole, are another part of the experimentation of these years. O'Keeffe's entire output is filled with unusual, highly original compositions. One of the defining traits that makes her work modern is the rejection of traditional guidelines for proper composition, the kinds of things that she would have been taught at art school, in favor of more dramatic approaches. The division of space down the center, pushing the mass of the painting outwards towards the edges is typical. Rarely is the entire composition contained. Strong sweeping lines or diagonals go beyond the edge of the canvas rather than being neatly held within the frame. It can be done vertically or horizontally. The lake shore itself often provided the perfect division, the hills surrounding the lake mirrored in the water or the sky reflected. Your painting, the de Young's painting of Lake George, is dramatically split. Intriguingly, this work is directly related to a handful of more abstract compositions, including a painting done later in the 1920s, Pink Abstraction. I'd even go so far as to suggest that this strategy is evident in one of O'Keeffe's most unusual and amusing paintings, The Cow Licking, which has to be one of the more creative ways to present a cow's head. O'Keeffe was fond of the cows that occasionally wandered onto the Stieglitz property from the neighboring farm. Growing up on a farm herself in Wisconsin, she found the agrarian aspects of Lake George refreshing and warmly nostalgic. It also probably helped that the Stieglitz family was greatly annoyed by the cows, perhaps making the occasional bovine incursion something of a secret delight for O'Keeffe. Cow licking is also unusual in that it is one of the very few paintings of living animals ever created by O'Keeffe. We know she liked her skulls, but this one still has flesh on the bone. Another work included in Modern Nature features crows flying high over Lake George. It, too, is intriguing and innovative in terms of its composition and visionary approach. The swelling mass of the lake, rimmed by hills and trees, is barely held within the limit of the canvas. Moreover, O'Keeffe presents a hybrid view of the lake, with the sweeping perspective of a bird's eye view, or even higher, as we seem to look down upon the crows, encompassing all of the lower portion of Lake George and then receding towards the north. It's an aerial view, before O'Keeffe had the experience of flight. She is most certainly relying upon her knowledge of the vista from Mount Prospect, the highest peak in the area, and a hike she made almost weekly during her time at Lake George. But it is also a more intimate view, with the slight edge of gossamer fabric on the right indicating that we are looking out through a window. It is the view out the window of the farmhouse at Lake George, looking directly down to the shore. She offers in this painting a simultaneous vision and yet somehow holds it all together. Where do these ideas come from? For me, the selection of works in Modern Nature forcefully demonstrates O'Keeffe's familiarity with modernist photography. Naturally, her relationship with Stieglitz put her in direct contact with the most avant-garde photographic practices of her day. She knew what modern photographers were attempting to achieve, and she thoroughly understood the technology and artistry of the camera. Many of the works in the show strike me as directly informed by photography. She understands the lens, she understands viewfinders, cropping, magnification. She speaks the flat, tonal language of the gelatin silver print. But as a painter, O'Keeffe could go beyond the technical limitations of the camera and printing technologies of the moment. Her radical compositions, with dramatic perspective and close cropping, are directly relatable to the work of Stieglitz, Strand, Steichen, and others. Consider, for example, how O'Keeffe tightly frames oak leaves pink and gray, zooming in and magnifying the leaves to fill the canvas edge to edge, producing an abstraction of leaves that is far more about volume, line, and form than it is about oak leaves. And color. She can paint at large scale in color, producing something that the photographers could not, and this ability, of course, produces the magnified flowers that have become so iconic. The small, delicate flowers of the petunia turned into glowing, flowing, billowing masses of color that fill a canvas from edge to edge. The connection with photography seems particularly poignant in the Lake George years and evident in the works in this show, but entire publications and exhibitions have been dedicated to the relationship between O'Keeffe's artwork and photography. What seems less well considered to me is the influence of other artists, earlier artists, upon Miss O'Keeffe. This can be largely attributed to Stieglitz, who actively promoted O'Keeffe as an authentically American artist, born on a farm, working in the hinterlands of Canyon, Texas, and free of the polluting influence of European training or travel. At a moment that a great many American artists were concerned about developing a distinctly national culture for the United States, O'Keeffe seemed to offer the ideal answer. And it was O'Keeffe, of course, who talked about the constant pressure to create the great American thing, providing the title for Wanda Corn's 2001 book on modern art and national identity. O'Keeffe's decision to move to New Mexico and her own efforts to define her image as the austere artist of the desert further solidified the sense that she was distinctly American, thoroughly modern. Furthermore, modernism itself is a series of rejections of the past. To be modern is to break with tradition. Therefore, O'Keeffe and Stieglitz rarely wrote or spoke directly about the influence of others, and the subsequent scholars have rarely discussed her debt to the past or her familiarity with art history. A mere glance at her biography is enough to reveal this falsehood. She studied at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Art Students League in New York. In these cities, she would have had access to the best collections of the day and would certainly have had opportunities to study the art of the past, from all periods and regions. From her letters to Stieglitz, we know that she was an observant and sophisticated museum goer. Moreover, through Stieglitz's exhibitions and publications, his own collection, she would have known the most avant-garde art being shown in America, even without visiting Europe. She would have known more about post-impressionism, cubism, and other modern art movements than the vast majority of Americans. She would have had personal experience of this artwork. And she was a voracious reader and followed all the latest developments in art practice. Reading Camera Work, Stieglitz's publication, alone would have placed O'Keeffe among the most advanced students of modernism. If O'Keeffe was not forthcoming in her words, her artwork can be more revealing. One of the more exciting aspects of uncreating the Modern Nature exhibit for the first time last June in Glens Falls was a repeated sense of recognition. In work after work, I saw vestiges of the past, examples of O'Keeffe seemingly echoing, emulating, or responding to other artists. In some cases, these quotations seem so obvious as to be a red herring. Could Starlight Night really be riffing on Van Gogh? Such direct adulation seems completely contrary to our sense of O'Keeffe's personality. She's simply too original, too distinctively different, too proud to create a painting that seems to be a tribute to another artist. And yet, the visual comparison is very hard to resist. In other examples, the comparison is less obvious, and the artist far less known today. How many of you are familiar with John White Alexander? That's what I suspected. Nearly forgotten today, at the height of his fame, at the end of the 19th century and in the first decade of the 20th century, Alexander was a highly regarded portrait painter, a friend of James McNeill Whistler, the American-born, he was an American-born, I'm talking about Alexander now, American-born but Paris-trained in the fashion of the day. He is known for his languid figures, often set in a soft, hazy landscape. While the portrait might include examples of the dramatic bravura brushwork for which Whistler, Sargent, and other 19th century portrait painters became famous, the background was often rendered with softly defined washes of color. Alexander even went so far as to work with linen manufacturers in France to develop a burlap-like canvas, as he liked how the rougher surface helped break up, paint, and diffuse light to further soften the background. With apologies to the models here, including Mrs. John White Alexander, I immediately thought of her husband's work when we unpacked this painting. The green background surrounding the cow is uncannily similar to some of the green backgrounds used by Alexander. Even the texture of the canvas seems coarser, more burlap-like than many used by O'Keeffe. I found no evidence of O'Keeffe discussing Alexander's work, but as a student at the Art Students League in 1907 and 08, studying with the likes of William Merritt Chase, F. Louis Mora, and Kenyon Cox, O'Keeffe most certainly would have had many opportunities to see the work of Alexander and others working in a similar style. In fact, this kind of soft painting was something of a fashion, found in the works of such artists as Thomas Wilmer Dewing, O'Keeffe's Art Student League teacher, William Merritt Chase, also employed a similar style of painting for the background of his portrait of the great Whistler, and it is Whistler himself who can largely be credited with initiating this style of soft painting. It emerges in his Nocturnes, ghostly, ethereal visions of the blue-green, gray, black of nighttime, with the essential dab of color placed just so. Most of the brushwork seems to dissolve into the rendering of the water, smoke, and fog itself. This is a painting acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago in 1900, so it is entirely possible, likely I would say, that O'Keeffe would have seen this while studying in Chicago in 1905 and 06. There are so many intriguing O'Keeffe precursors in Whistler's work and life. His unusual dramatic compositions, his deep appreciation for the aesthetic of Japanese woodblock prints, his mastery of technique, his insistence upon the transcendent importance of beauty, his sense of the relationship between music and abstraction, going so far as to call some of his own works symphonies, and even his masterful self-fashioning as a modern artist. There is certainly enough for another talk or another exhibition. But for now, let me follow a different thread. Nocturnes, images of the night, which also became something of a vogue in the long shadow of Whistler's influence in the 20th century. Of the many artists to follow in the wake of Whistler, Edward Steichen came to mind as we studied the modern nature paintings. Best known for his photographs, from ghostly pictorial images like The Pond, this print with hand-applied color, a gift to the Metropolitan Museum from Stieglitz's collection. His work frequently appeared in camera work. Though he later abandoned painting to pursue photography, destroying many of his paintings in the process, there are a handful of nocturnes and landscapes that survive. In these, I see a kinship with some of O'Keeffe's images of Lake George. Most specifically, in her image of an early moonrise over the lake from 1930. It shares thematic and compositional similarities, as well as an interest in understanding how color shifts with changing lighting conditions. The Lake George works also make nods to O'Keeffe's immediate contemporaries, not just those of the past. In Barn with Snow, one of the two related barn pictures included in the exhibition, I see her responding to and in dialogue with the precisionism of an artist like Charles Sheeler. Consider two of his barn paintings from 1932 and 34. I see more than the shared subject matter, a thoroughly American and regional subject with particular resonance during the Great Depression and as the country entered the Dust Bowl. O'Keeffe is trying on some aspects of precisionism. Note the detail of the rock foundation. It is practically a quotation of the rock walls prominent in Sheeler's photos and paintings of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Another way in which we see O'Keeffe in conversation with her immediate peers is in the frequent use of symbolic portraits. Most frequently associated with the poster portraits of Charles Demuth, here his portrait of William Carlos Williams and his portrait of O'Keeffe, it was something of a fad among modernist artists. A handful of O'Keeffe's paintings in modern nature can be read as symbolic portraits. The most obvious example, Lake George Coat in Red, tips its hat, or perhaps that's a cane, with the title, which alludes to Alfred Stieglitz's red-lined wool cape, which he was known for. It is about as close to a figural portrait as O'Keeffe's paintings ever come. But there are other examples too, from her own abstracted knees in the rowboat of Series 1, to the several Apple family paintings which have been interpreted as portraits of the various members of the Stieglitz family. I saw recently that a critic described Brown and Tan Leaves as a portrayal of O'Keeffe, Stieglitz, and Dorothy Norman, who became Stieglitz's lover after they met in 1927. My strong instinct is that O'Keeffe would never have given Dorothy Norman space in one of her paintings, ever. She would barely mention that woman's name, much less include it in something so beautiful as this particular work. From symbolic portraits, we might move to considering the tree portraits. These bold, powerful canvases filled with nearly anthropomorphic visions of the various trees that covered the Lake George property. O'Keeffe and Stieglitz and various friends wrote about and talked about these trees like they were members of the family. They would go off to visit the old maple and check in on the dying chestnut trees, silent victims of the chestnut blight. A few of the tree portraits further demonstrate O'Keeffe's familiarity with the most avant-garde art being practiced in Europe or America. Autumn trees revealing a clear knowledge of Mondrian's transition from representation to abstraction, as Bruce Robertson explains in his essay in the exhibition catalog. But more importantly than looking to a European modernist like Mondrian, the tree portraits help us recognize two other key insights derived from modern nature: the shared creative passion between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, and the way in which both the artwork made at Lake George and the seasonal lifestyle established on the hill foreshadow her later New Mexico experience. Nowhere is the artistic and creative dialogue between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz more visible than at Lake George, where they often portrayed the same subjects and locations, discussed their ambitions, and compared results. In the many related tree portraits they both produced, we gain a sense of the conversation the two shared, spoken through their image making, each using the particular strengths of their medium, their materials and techniques, to articulate different aspects of the same subject, and each basing their work in their direct and sincere, deeply felt natural response, the response to the natural world. We see it, too, in their fascination with the ever-variable weather of Lake George, and the compelling displays of light, shadow, and contrast produced by clouds that passed over the rim of the lake. Stieglitz's great landmark series of equivalents, widely regarded as the first abstract photographs, and described by Stieglitz himself as summarizing his philosophy of life and conveying everything he'd learned over 40 years of photography. They are produced at Lake George while in conversation with O'Keeffe. Is it any accident that the equivalents emerge as their love is blossoming? And is it any accident that O'Keeffe paints her radical, lyrical celebration, a symphony of cloud forms, the year they're married? Is this another portrait, perhaps a modernist version of a wedding portrait? There is a final, late painting in the exhibition, which I believe offers important visual evidence of the relationship between O'Keeffe, Stieglitz, and her thoughts about Lake George. When I mentioned the curious aspects of the 1925 Flagpole painting, I promised to come back to the later painting, created in 1959, Flagpole and White House. The compositions are clearly similar, with a few distinct differences, of course, in palette and framing, revealing a bit more of the foreground in front of the house. There is no doubt in this case about the daylight colors of the lilac bushes that surround the darkroom, even if the half moon is retained. Curiously, the direction of the weather vane is reversed. This work, of course, was painted more than a dozen years after O'Keeffe's final visit to Lake George in 1946 to spread Stieglitz ashes. I read great significance into this painting, seeing it as a testament to her lasting loyalty to Stieglitz, despite everything, and as evidence of her enduring appreciation for Lake George itself. Whatever she might have said later in life about Lake George, her painting of this scene, presumably entirely from memory, though it's possible that she also reconsidered Stieglitz photos of the little house, it presents a place of brightness and color, of natural beauty and creative productivity. Comparing the Lake George works with some of her most iconic New Mexico subjects confirms that O'Keeffe's visual language has a remarkable consistency throughout her life, which finds expression regardless of subject or location. To make this point, consider two of the Lake George works that we've already discussed. Both contain some of the characteristic compositional strategies used in so many of her works: the canvas divided down the center, significant lines in mass flowing off beyond the edge. It's a structure that emerges in some of her earliest works, including those shared with Stieglitz by her friend Anita Politzer, awakening him to the possibilities of what he called a woman on paper. And yet, knowing her New Mexico paintings more intimately, I was excited to see in the Lake George paintings certain precursors of New Mexico. It's completely imaginative and speculative on my part, but I have this sense of Miss O'Keeffe exploring the arid landscape of New Mexico in those first few years and recognizing already embedded in the land her language, her lines, her shapes, as if New Mexico had always been waiting for her. Here, one of the several renderings of the Black Place, a dramatic, eroded landscape of stark contrasts, and a particular gully that she identified that creates this fascinating zigzag division, much like that scene in Celebration. In another example, we find the roots, pun intended, of one of the most iconic of New Mexican subjects. O'Keeffe begins painting the crosses, spread across the landscape of New Mexico, as she said, quote, like a thin, dark veil of the Catholic Church, end quote, during her first summer in Taos in 1929. They are insistently, distinctly of that region. To this day, you can find crosses scattered throughout the desert, surmounting hilltops or surrounding the aging adobe muradas of the Penitente Brotherhood, including the one that's just up around the corner from O'Keeffe's house at Abiquiu. And yet, as this comparison makes clear, the language and structure had already been developed by painting the trees of Lake George. Both the tree and the cross are elegiac, pointing onward to something big and powerful. Having lived with Black Cross on our galleries all last summer, the comparison with Chestnut Gray was immediate for me. They follow such similar compositions, with the large central trunk or beam dividing the canvas, placed immediately in the foreground, with the landscape not so much receding as simply existing beyond the tree or cross. And those stars in the glowing sky. In the Chestnut Gray, it's that one perfect dot. In Black Cross, they spot the sky, as they always do at night in New Mexico. But O'Keeffe includes the perfect number, not one too many, nor one too few. In terms of subject, both are, in one way or another, about death and the possibility of rebirth, and about spirit and a sense of something grander than the human imagination. Beyond even her artwork, Lake George provided a template for the lifestyle she established in New Mexico. I've had the good fortune to become familiar with Miss O'Keeffe's homes at Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch in a way that few others are allowed. We're trying to change that, I promise. In coming to understand how O'Keeffe lived in New Mexico, it's become increasingly clear that the patterns and choices deployed at Ghost Ranch and perfected at Abiquiu, her two homes, actually began at Lake George. Consider first the layout of the Stieglitz property. The first building encountered when coming up from Bolton Road is the farmhouse, where the family gathered and where Georgia and Alfred had bedrooms. It's just right there. Stieglitz's little house, his dark room, is just across from the house, a few steps away, right here. And where is the shanty, the aging outbuilding that O'Keeffe repaired and made into her studio? It's about as far from everyone else as possible, way at the edge of the property. To be productive, O'Keeffe needed a space of her own and isolation. She needed to be free of the distractions and unnecessary socializing of the Stieglitz household. At Ghost Ranch, where she began spending summers in 1936, she actually remodeled the house slightly, closing off several doors in order to isolate the largest part of the house as a private studio and bedroom. So she closed off the door from the kitchen into the living room and then made this space her studio and bedroom, or sitting room and then bedroom on the corner here. To the north, out of the enlarged picture windows she installed, she had a view of the layered yellow and white cliffs that envelop Ghost Ranch. Out the door to the south, her patio framed her beloved Pedernal. Alas, Ghost Ranch, as a summer residence, lacked one of the finest amenities of Lake George, the gardens and orchards providing fresh fruits and produce. For this, she doggedly pursued a crumbling adobe compound in Abiquiu, on the road between Santa Fe and the Ghost Ranch. The original road, a slow, rutted dirt route, ran immediately past the walled complex, which had been abandoned for some time. She occasionally would stop to admire the garden on her way to Ghost Ranch. It had been kept irrigated by the neighbors in order to preserve the water rights. It's irrigated from the main ditch, the Acequia Madre. And the zaguan door also held her attention, leading to that patio with its mysterious black door. She finally managed to acquire the property in 1945, and then spent 4 years remodeling. In addition to restoring the gardens, she took another outbuilding, a carriage house, and as with the shanty before, converted it into her studio, adding a bedroom as she had in her personal suite at Ghost Ranch. So it's a little hard to make out, but this is the main part of the house, and you go outside, it's completely divided, and here's her studio and bedroom. O'Keeffe also replicated the seasonal rhythm of Lake George. Ghost Ranch became her summer home, private and isolated, more like Lake George. Abiquiu was her winter home. The small village was not New York, but it was nonetheless more densely inhabited than Ghost Ranch and closer to the amenities of Espanola or Santa Fe. While at Ghost Ranch in the summer, the garden was maintained by her gardener, and fresh fruits and vegetables were brought to the ranch each week. Indeed, O'Keeffe maintained a small staff at all times to manage her homes and allow her to focus on her artwork and career. This, too, the management of a property, is a skill that O'Keeffe developed at Lake George, where she was increasingly tasked with running the affairs of the Hill as her relationship with Stieglitz matured. And as she'd done at Lake George, at Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch, she faced a constant stream of visitors and requests for more, and had to carefully manage these visits to preserve her independence. The physical separation from the main house was a key part of this strategy. So let me conclude. More and more, as we've lived with the works from Lake George this past fall in our galleries in Santa Fe, it became obvious to me and my colleagues that many patterns that we thought of as representative of her New Mexico years actually first emerged in the Adirondacks. It was also obvious that the lifelong trajectory of O'Keeffe's creativity was both more consistent and more dynamic than many scholars have acknowledged. There is a remarkable aesthetic continuity. Her visual language flows gracefully from subject to subject, decade to decade. In our galleries at this moment in Santa Fe, we have some of the very last works created by Miss O'Keeffe. In 1978, when she was in her early 90s and functionally blind from macular degeneration, and yet somehow she still managed to create watercolors and charcoal sketches unassisted. They, like many of her late-in-life works, particularly the watercolors, retain a boldness and powerful abstract beauty that recalls nothing so much as her earliest, most innovative works from the very beginning of the 20th century. At the same time, she pushed herself relentlessly, constantly experimenting and perfecting her craft. Nowhere is this malleability and freshness more visible than in the paintings in the galleries here. I encourage you to spend time with modern nature, to absorb the many lessons to be learned from this exhibition. Miss O'Keeffe was famous for her reticence to speak or write about her own work, claiming that all one needed to know was in the work itself. After learning from Lake George, I've come to realize that she was right. All we need to know is there on the canvas. Thank you.